All right, welcome back, Martha and Gary. Great to see you. We're here for our post-webinar Q&A session. We just finished our webinar on making sense of data governance and resource management, and now we have a little bit of time left to dive into the outstanding questions from our audience. So thank you and welcome back. Let's kick off with Kuntanda's question. Can well-captured, organized resource management governance data reports influence or impact delivery to not staff a project or to tell sales to not go after a client based on past trends, past percentage of conversion, etc., so as to reduce risk of overhiring, overallocating, purely by data only? I understand it will also depend on how much we capture. What are your thoughts? Who wants to start? Gary.
I can jump into this one and I kind of take it from the middle, because the question poses around reducing the risk of overhiring or over allocating, right? I think that comes down to probability adjustments around your capacity, right? So you make more conservative, let's say, decisions about what headcount you may hire or not. So if the forecast likelihood is 50%, you want to take those hours, you want to take that head count and chop it right in half, right? Because then, you can kind of hedge your bets either way, whether it's going to convert or not with, let's say, minimal risk or less risk, if that. I think part of the question is also kind of really talking about, sales behavior. Can we influence it? Maybe, right? If you have strong reporting, and I'll always say this, if there is analytics to back up the story and what you're saying and what you're presenting, have at it. Generally, it will have an impact, and you'll be able to have an effect on some of those behaviors. Um, but realistically, the sales cycle, can be wobbly enough as it is, right? Depending on the organization or depending on how far into the deal cycle that they are. Um, so again, as far as ORM, I think probability adjusting your forecasted demand will make sure that you're minimizing some of the risks. But if you have data to support staffing or not staffing something, yeah, bring it to the table, have the conversation. But sales will ultimately do what sales do as well. If there's a possibility that it will be sold, they're going to go after it.
Nice. Thank you, Gary, for your thoughts. How about you, Martha?
Yeah, I would add that if you have good costing information as well on what's your anticipated cost, your anticipated duration to deliver like kind work, then that can help your sales organization put forward the right amount in the proposal to make the deal profitable. I think that's one thing that we're optimizing at JFF, Jobs for the Future, is that we're really looking at historical performance of work and coming up with really good cost estimates of what it takes to deliver. That can sometimes make or break a decision of whether a deal is pursued. Because if you're in contract negotiations, and again, this is not really resource management, this is that pipeline management life cycle, but your executives should have a view into what makes for a profitable deal. And I know we've talked about it sometimes for Jobs for the Future, since we're a national nonprofit focused on equitable and quality jobs for all Americans, that sometimes there might be certain projects that are not the best fit for us to go after because they're not focused on perhaps our target markets that we're looking at, or our North Star outcomes. And so those may be more discussion points. And I do think that what you don't go after is just as important as what you go after. Because if you go after if your company goes after a deal that's going to be not profitable in the end, then you could overhire, or you could, deploy your resources in a way that's less effective. If we're not talking about external deals, and you're talking about internal deployment of talent, let's say you have a key initiative, making sure that if there are any, if you're in a resource constrained environment that you're prioritizing your demand as it comes in, perhaps external facing work is a higher priority than internal facing work, and maybe there's an extra approval that you need to supply the resources for internal work. We've had that during limited times where we were at a resource bottleneck standpoint and we needed to prioritize external facing work over internal initiatives. So sometimes there could be things that you don't want to go after, and having that good information can make or break that sometimes.
Mm, nice. Yes. Thanks both for your answers. Very valuable insights. The next question is from Mayank. How do we track and report data contributions to data governance compliance and audit requirements? Martha, do you want to kick off?
Sure. I'm going to interpret a little bit of this of how do you track the benefits of your data governance processes as part of the question. And so for me, looking at those outcomes and seeing where you're implementing perhaps some really good data governance processes. Perhaps you have your data governance committee or your data stewards. And then you have that process map that where you looked at your data map and you said what was red, yellow, or green, being able to cite improvements year over year or, biannually and say this was a red data element where we had this kind of lag in this element, and now we've improved it to where we have higher quality, higher outcomes. I think that's a way to quantify benefits. Also, with good data governance and standards, protocols, and processes, if there's any audit questions, you should be able to have that documentation. Your organization should have, like, who governs this data? That should be something that's part of this, right? That's determined part of your data governance process. That's determined in that process. So who governs the data? Who has access to the data? Again, we covered that in our What is Data Governance section of the webinar. And so having all of that mapped out and defined, maintained, and standardized can help in an audit situation, because you'll know, your organization will know who exactly to go to for data for a certain system, who has access to see it, and all of those standards will be already defined. So that should help with audit and compliance.
Mm, nice. Thanks for outlining the benefits of getting data governance right. Gary, what would you like to add?
Yeah, look, same interpretation as Martha. I mean, and what you mentioned around outcomes and impacts, right? That's always going to tell the strongest story when it comes to something like data governance. Now, if I put a different kind of hat on and look at it from a compliance or an audit perspective, again, quantify, quantify, quantify. You have the data to hand. The focus here is obviously data governance, but if you begin to build some even basic scoring mechanisms, that can feed into being able to actually even show internal or external auditors an improvement over time, a trend line, right? It also lets you know the impact that you're having in your communication and the enablement that we spoke of in the webinar, right? So is this taking hold? Is change happening? Is there a better focus on this now? And you can only do that with data as well. So being able to quantify it, harness it, and say, well, actually, we've been tracking this, and here's our score over a period of time, and you can actually see the improvement. That's hugely beneficial. So I think you can track it, and it doesn't need to be over-engineered or super complex, right? It can be very straightforward, very simple. Um, if we think of an example, even for again through an RM lens, one of the key things that RMs and RMOs focus on early on is their skills inventory and skills management, right? Now, depending on the organization and how that's rolled out, people tend to rate themselves against those skills or associate themselves to those skills, let's say. Um, Again, there's an ability to track that and to score that from a compliance perspective, right? X percentage of the population or the head count have not updated their skills in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, whatever criteria you want to use. And if you want to get even more complex on it, it could be a skills proficiency index, right? Number of ratings, number of people rated, highest ratings, all this kind of thing. So again, it can be as complex or as simple as you like, but just being able to quantify it, it's going to have the biggest impact with an auditor. It's going to have the biggest impact with an executive. And it's going to have the biggest impact in showing what has actually occurred, what's happened, and the improvements made. Because otherwise, sometimes it's kind of, yeah, we think things have, improved or we've optimized something, but we're not able to actually represent it tangibly.
Mm. Yeah, well said. Nice. Thanks both of you for your answer. Now I'm curious if you can outline what are signs of low data governance maturity. What would we look out for in a low data governance maturity organization?
Anyone saying we don't know what's going on from a resource management perspective, from a, you know, at its simplest level, I even think of forecasting, right? Is your forecast reliable? What is the difference between your planned versus actuals? What is the difference between what was forecasted within a specific period and what you actually hit, what you made, right? Whether you take that as bookings to billings, whether you take that, I mean, there's multiple ways of slicing and dicing this, but at the core of it, I guess the point is, um, do you know where you're at today and where you're going? If the answer to that in multiple different areas is no, it's probably at a low, right? Because there's not enough data feeding or there's not enough kind of insights coming out of the data, right?
Mhm.
Now, it could be because we actually don't have a tool in place yet, right?
Mhm.
We have a process, we know what it looks like, but we don't have a tool, or we don't, and that's fine too, right? What I'm saying is, again, getting into that kind of position of scoring yourself of where you are today and being able to say, okay, this is where we want to track to in order to improve and to optimize. Um, it's going to be rare for anyone. It's the same with maturity in RM, same as maturity in data governance. It's going to be rare that you reach nirvana, right? I think there's a constant moving target because the business changes as well, and the function changes and things um uh you know they improve over time, right? Hopefully, but there's also um, changes occurring in the business. So if that's the case, it's usually a moving target. You just want to be trending in the right direction, right? You don't need to be super high on like, you know, senior or five, we've hit the threshold. More than likely you've hit it in some areas and you haven't in others, right? So it's a constant evolving thing.
Yeah, thank you so much. That lifts some weight off the shoulders, I can imagine. Martha, what would you say are some signs of lower maturity data governance?
Yeah, I would say low would be lack of awareness, right, of the data elements, who governs them, lack of standards, right?
Mhm.
What does good look like? What does timely updates look like? Lack of processes would be low, maturity, and then also lack of quality data. So that data being scored red, right? And it can be a relative basis, in terms of like what's green, what's yellow, what's red, or what's orange and red. And then I love the idea of forecasting being your ultimate barometer of, data accuracy, because that's super critical in terms of how you deploy your staff. How often can you forecast and with what error range? Um, in terms of where you're going and where you need to be? How often do you miss your forecast in terms of you need more resources in the moment and you didn't forecast for it, right? Is that an outlier? How much of an outlier is it? So obviously, as Gary said, like perfection is it's probably not an outcome we're all gonna get to. But there's it's the process of just constant improvement and seeing where you can take it to the next level. What's the most important data element that you can take to the next level using your regular and green assessment? That can
And
help you see if you're in the middle then you're probably in the middle of a maturity, right, curve.
Yeah, thank you so much. And when we dive into tooling, I wonder what is your view on lower maturity? We talked a little bit about spreadsheets in our prep session, so maybe you can take us through that example because I find it quite practical and easy to understand.
Yeah, lack of common data elements is a low standard. No tool is probably you're at a 0, 1. I think it's a typical resource management curve. If you don't have a tool, you're probably on that lower part of the journey. Or let's just say earlier part of the journey. And then integrations, right? That having that frequency of data be automated, that probably gets you a little bit higher on that curve. Um, I think those are some things that come to mind. What do you think, Gary?
Yeah, look, I agree. I think, it's funny because and I love the way you rephrased it, right? That you kind of an earlier maturity, right? Earlier phase of cycle, because you could go into an organization that has an absolute monolith of technology, right? Huge tool, tons of data, but the processes haven't been managed well, or the RM function is just getting stood up way after the fact, whatever the case may be. And you're kind of very much behind the eight ball there. Whereas if you are in a position where, to your point, there isn't a tool, maybe you are in spreadsheets and it is conversations and it's very basic processes, you really have an opportunity to build from a solid place then, right? There's not all of this kind of course corrective measures or trying to, work backwards to what you're, trying to improve in terms of data quality even, right? If we think about bigger systems, bigger tools that have been active for a longer time, there's just reams and reams of data, right? So you're now talking about, do you mass update that? Do you mass migrate it? How do you handle that to even plan for the future or to use it as a kind of predictive analytics path or whatever the case may be? But again, those early phases, it's grassroots, right? Say, where do we want to get to? What do we need to get there? And you build it step by step. Um, and it means, by the way, by the time you even get to the point of selecting a tool, ORM actually already has a strong, good seat at the table to kind of influence that decision or at minimum have a perspective on which tool would work best, whether that's financially or resource management related or capacity related or visualization, so on and so forth. So, um, yeah, that's kind of what comes to mind. I'm not sure if I fully answered the question, but
Yeah, brilliant. You both did, absolutely. And if we dive into standardization, what does good look like in terms of data standardization in the space of RM?
Yeah, I love the idea of having less texty, free form data inputs. And it's kind of a simplified view, but getting to standard pick lists, um, and standardizing across systems, right? So, you're not using, I'm just going to make up this example, but you're not using miles in one system and meters in another, right? Like you really want to have the systems be able to talk to one another, in the most meaningful way. And that can really help you. And that can also help you on reporting front because you can't really report on things that are very free form. It's very hard to do. I mean, you could do word clouds and all kinds of things, but if you're getting data that's coming in different ways and people are defining terms differently, then how can you say what the most impactful skills are if people are just verbally describing skills in different ways, right? Um,
Very good example. Gary, what is top of your mind?
yeah, I mean, I'm all for what Martha was saying. I think the less freeform, the better. The more pick list drop down, it just automatically creates a standard. And the earlier you can do that, again, you're all the better for it. Will it change over time? Could those records and those lists need to be maintained and updated over time? Sure, sure. But as a starting point, kind of standardizing those really helps. Um, Early in RM. one of the kind of value propositions is making sure that staffing isn't happening in silos, right? And that means going across teams, across functions, across business units. So they're not all the same. Um, but probably the first thing to understand is where they converge and where they diverge, right? So, because then the messaging is different, the way of getting to some level of standardization um, will be there because we're not looking necessarily for a kind of cookie cutter situation because some of the things just may not apply in the same way, but at least helps you kind of take some of that information on board, work with those stakeholders, lay it all out so that you can be intentional, I suppose, with some of that mapping where it crosses over, where it doesn't, where we've been able to rationalize or normalize things, and where we have not, but why, right? And being able to articulate that and keep it in consideration for the future as well, right? Maybe that you can't execute on that today, but in the future you might be able to. So, yeah, I think it's just understanding the difference between the stakeholders, the functions, the groups, depending on how lo large the RM's focus is um, and also being able to account for that in the technology. So standardize as much as you can while understanding there's variances.
Yeah, that's a very helpful guideline. Thank you. And through your example that you shared, I again can see very clearly the importance of the resource management role inside the organization, right? Even though it might not be the accountability of the resource manager to standardize certain aspects of the business, he or she can be the driving force of making those improvements, and it will help the entire business. So such a big engine for business optimization and improvement overall, right? Through the lens of resource management, which I find super inspiring. Cool. And the last question I have is just when we talk about data governance, certain data points are quite critical, sensitive, right? We need to take a special like care of. Also, we talked about the profiles and access rights earlier when we talked about the definition of data governance. So I'm just wondering, what are some examples, some call outs where you would advocate for, being aware that these data points have to be handled with care?
I just say if you see any information that, is questionable, it's almost very much like that PII and a lot of the trainings that go on internally for organizations, right? Flag it. Talk to security team, talk to legal team, and just understand whether this is something that should be either locked down, not visible to you, or not visible to others, whatever the case may be. But it takes people speaking about it, it takes people kind of stepping in and, having a conversation with the right parties. Because if the assumption that is that someone else is going to do it, more than likely it's not going to happen. And ORM tends to do this quite a bit across the business, where we talked about what they own, what they govern, but again, that influence, that ability to see things and see the bigger picture, you know, it puts us in that position where we're probably highlighting multiple things all over the business, right? So I just recommend, partnering with different parts of the organization where necessary. Um, and of course, as far as the system goes and data, if there's sensitive information that's not critical to actually running the business or for a different function, again, you lock that stuff down. It doesn't need to be visible. It doesn't need to be accessible, right? And you can work with your IT, your biz tech teams, as I said, as well, to ensure that that's happening, whether it's a PSA tool, PPM tool, HR tool.
Nice, well put. Thanks, Gary. Martha, any other thoughts on sensitive information?
Yeah, like what was mentioned, what is needed to run the business? I think one simple example or two simple examples is, someone's physical location. Sometimes you're deploying someone to an initiative because they're within country or they're within a city, or within some kind of commuting distance that makes it affordable to the price based off of how the work was scoped and priced. And so, do you need someone's home address? No, you don't need someone's home address. Do you need a city or country code or even some kind of postal zip code? That could be used, right? So it keeps certain level private It keeps, but it gives you what you need to do a staff deployment based off of a geographical concern. Um, Things like hourly rates, the organization determining whether it's going to be on your front end of your project staffing details. Perhaps you don't need that. Perhaps there's certain ranges that can be used instead, or perhaps there's only certain role types that can see certain information on a rate. Or even is it the billable rate to the client that makes more sense to show and use it for your planning? So things like that should be considered. And if you don't need the information for the work and to optimize the business, then you shouldn't be looking at it, right? Or talk to, like was mentioned, your data governance team, your data stewards, and even, you could talk to your HR department as well.
Very, very nice. Awesome. Thanks both of you for sharing your insights on that topic, which I find very interesting. To wrap us up, I would just love to ask you, what is your main takeaway from our conversation on data governance? What are you taking away from this discussion?
Yeah, I mean it's been great. The engagement with the topic is a regular one with ORM, so they're passionate about it. They understand its importance, which is a great sign because I think that equally points to the maturity of an ORM organization, and where they can have the most impact and add the most value. So that's a key takeaway for me that it's a work in progress, right? And people are at different stages of their maturity, of their build out, of their, technology, what tools they're using and whatnot. Um, but people are proactively thinking about data governance. And, again, one of the other things that I'm taking away from this is again, there's the policies, the procedures, the processes, and whatnot. There's the technology aspects of it. There's the enablement of people side and communication. A lot of this, again, from an ORM perspective, and even for the rest of the business. Um, One of the key things here is that you don't get the same level of business insights if the data is not strong, if it's not governed effectively, right? And that should matter to everyone. So that's kind of one of the key takeaways. I think even based on some of the questions that people were asking, they're thinking about this in different ways, which is great to see. Um, but they're also, have their eye on the prize in terms of actually the better and stronger we do here, the better the outcomes because we're understanding, we're learning, we're predicting, we know where we're headed, and we can set ourselves up for success.
Nice. Awesome wrap up. Thank you, Gary. Martha, what are your final thoughts and takeaways?
Yeah, I was gonna say highlighting the value of the outcome improvements and keeping that front and center. Like, I think it was a good discussion and helped me rethink about don't get in the minutia of the data when you're communicating up, keep it high level, keep it the big picture and what you're driving and what are the benefits on the outcomes into the business decisions we can make. And then like internally facing for my team, like what can we automate? Like just being reinvigorated in that and helping to like not just be plugging holes one by one, but like what can we do big picture that will make it easier for all of us? Building those logic flows and looking at that instead of trying to solve it piecemeal or like one project update at a time.
Amazing. Super inspiring. Awesome. Well, thanks both of you very much. A, for the webinar, which was so joyful, and B, for this post-webinar Q&A session where we got to dive a bit deeper. And I think I learned heaps in both discussions. So thank you very much for your time and your energy in both discussions.
Thank you.
It's always great seeing you all. So
Yeah, you
thank you
too.
for having us.